Okay, so now that we have our front and back pants along with the contour waistbands, what we're going to do is when we start to develop the side seam pocket, all we need to focus on right now is just the front main body pattern piece. Okay, so for this part of the video, what I've done is I've set up the camera so it's straight overhead so you can see flat down onto my tabletop. I also put some white paper behind here. That way, when I start stacking other pieces of paper on top, you'll be able to see through because I have a white background. If you need to, you can also set up your workstation like this so you have a white background as well. What I want to do is, here is the side seam of my front pant pattern piece, and the contour waistband, we have it set off to the side. I'm going to take the side seam here and I'm going to turn it so it's facing towards me. So when you're looking at this, the waist is up here and this is the knees and heading towards the ankles. The reason why I want to have this set up is because we're going to start developing a pocket here for the side seam. And since this pair of pants is for the right side of the body, your right hand is what's going to go into the pocket. Now the shaping for the pocket, when we are completed, is going to look like this. So here you can see I can put my hand into my pocket, or something like your cell phone would go down inside that pocket. Let's talk a little bit more about making your pocket totally from scratch. The first thing we want to establish is about how deep is this pocket. Now when I come over here and I'm looking at a completed pocket with my hand inside of here, this will give you a sense of the size and the shape of the pocket. So if I pull this away, what you need to do at home is you need to determine, here's the top of the waist. The opening for the pocket should be about 1 inch below that. So from the top of the waist, I'm going to drop down 1 inch. And then I know my hand will start to slide inside of here. So somewhere down here would be another comfortable amount of room on both sides so I can get my hand in and out of this pocket. Once it's inside of here, your wrist will come up to about where the side seam is. So then you can see this would be the shape of the pocket. Again, you're looking for something that looks about like this. When I come in here, if I measure from the top of the waist down to what I think is about the bottom of my pocket, I can see that it's probably around 10, almost 11 inches. And then if I'm looking at the depth from the seam allowance coming into here, again, it's right around 8 or 9 inches. Now, if I want to prepare a piece of paper to make my pocket pattern, if I go ahead and do 12 inches by 12 inches square, we'll have enough paper to do this. If we take a look at the pocket that I've already made, you can see here I have the grain line and the horizontal bounce line at the full part of the hip. And that's this area right here. So once I lined up those locations, I was also making sure I had enough room all the way around the pattern piece to come out here to the side seams and above the waist. So bring in your blank piece of paper and make sure it's going a little bit above the waist and for sure beyond the side seams. And then once you have that, then you can come in and you can start to move this around to where we'll have some matrix dots going perfectly with the grain line, and again some dots that are going perfectly with this full hip level line. Once I'm lining up the full hip level and the grain lines, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tape this along the grain line heading down towards the knee level, and I'm going to tape this at the horizontal bounce line over here at the zipper and center front. And this way I can still peel this open and I can see the pocket down below that I'm starting to draw in here. Now let's take a closer look here at the waist and the side seam. Up here I can see that this is the waist area meeting up with the side seam. And I want to have that little bit of a corner here. Another thing is we're going to want the whole side seam because eventually our pocket is going to match up with that side seam curve. For now I'm going to ignore the seam allowance and I just want to get the actual side seam itself. And for me, I know that when I did my pants, I had the number 12 here at the full hip level, and that's how I got my curve for the side seam. So I could bring this in here. I've already put some dots on here, and I can follow that same curve. Now again, here's the waistline. What we want to do is we want to come down 1 inch. And this is to help us determine for your hand coming into the pocket. And then later on, we're going to add seam allowance going back up towards the waist. But you want to have room to where this pocket does not get caught in the waist when you're sewing, because this pocket bag should be able to hang free. The second thing you want to do is you want to give yourself a little bit of room going below that opening, then your hand, and a little bit of room after it. And then you can determine somewhere down in this area would make a really nice opening for your hand coming into the pocket. You don't want this opening to get too big because then as you're walking, the opening will kind of open and close a little bit, and if it's bigger, it's more noticeable. So taking a look at my pocket here, you can see that this is the beginning of the opening at the top, and that's the opening here at the bottom, and my hand goes inside. Eventually we're going to add seam allowance to the bottom, seam allowance to the top. Now down in this area, you don't really need to know the actual bag and the seam allowance. The most important thing is we want the bottom edge of the bag, including the seam allowance, to curve back up and match with the side seam. So what I've done now is I put my pocket in its place so you can see what you're aiming for. This is what you're going to be looking at though, is just your blank paper on top. Now I'm lightly tracing off the pocket shaping that I personally want for my hand or for something like my cell phone. Okay, so do this with me now. What we're going to do is this top opening of our pocket, which is 1 inch down from the waistband, and we're going to highlight this is the entire opening for the pocket itself to the bottom of the opening. Now your pocket bag, what you want when it's finished is you want this to scoop down and around your hand. It'll drop down with gravity, and then once it comes to the bottom, it's curving back and starting to aim for the base of the opening of your pocket. So go ahead and try this now. Eventually, what we're going to do is we're going to need to add seam allowance going to the outside of this pocket. So you can see here I've already added seam allowance to this example. Now adding seam allowance at the top is pretty easy. You just come up whatever your seam allowance is. So for instance, I did 1/2 inch, and then it's going to be 1/2 inch seam allowance following this. The trick down here at the bottom is you want the seam allowance to blend back into the side seam. So it's going to come up and it's going to blend into the side seam here. So what we're going to do is, starting from your highlighter, we're going to still drop down one more 1/2 inch and circle that. Now this location is what your seam allowance will be aiming for. So if this was the pocket depth you liked, we're going to add 1/2 inch. That 1/2 inch will eventually come back up to this point here, which is 1/2 inch below the bottom of the opening. Since we have a pretty good idea of what we're going to do, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with the seam allowance because it's a lot easier to blend here into the side seam. So here's what my seam allowance is going to be doing. And when I come up to the top here, here's my 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then I can blend my seam allowance coming out of that. Now what we can do is you can pretty much freehand the shape of this pocket. I know for me, if I try to come in here and keep using my French tool, then you end up moving it quite a bit, and sometimes it's easier to just freehand it. And what we're working on right now is the seam allowance. So the very outside edges of your pocket is what we're the most concerned about. For me, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make this darker in just a minute. But what I want to do right now is I need to also have my seam allowance for the edge of the pocket, and that's going to sew right along here with the side seam of your pants. So what we're going to do is here where we drop down 1/2 inch, you're going to square out beyond the side seam. And up here where we have our 1/2 inch seam allowance, do the same thing there as well. So underneath here on our pants, here's that side seam. And what you could do is you can come in, put a few dots where you can see the side seam through the pattern piece. And then again, for me, I know my number 12 lined up with the full hip right here. So what I can do is I can find the angles that matches to the side seam, and then I can come out and I can see the same angles here on the seam allowance. And now for our pocket bag, we have the full seam allowance going all the way around the exterior shape. And then this horizontal bounce line here will become our notch to sew the pocket to the pants. Alright, so let's untape this and then let's get this darkened in a little bit better. Now that I've darkened in the main outside shape of my pocket, I'm going to go ahead and just draw the seam that will be on the inside of the pocket. If I start here at the base of the pants, I know that I'm going to sew into the pocket at 1/2 inch, and then I'm going to start following this curve. And then I can just double check here that the highlighted opening is the beginning of my seam here and the bottom of my seam there. Now a couple things we can do is we can erase this extra line right here and heading down, and then there's some extra lines up here at the top. Let's go ahead and make this notch right here a little bit darker. Right here is the grain line. Let's go ahead and put an arrow at the bottom and at the top. And we'll label this side seam pocket. And just to make sure that this matches back to my slopers, my sloper was the size 6 pant. So I'll make sure to put a nice big size 6 on here. And I like having the date on there because if I make changes to my pocket, I'll know which one is the newer pocket. Now we can see when I bring in my front pants, the side seam pocket bag is going to match right up here at the horizontal balance line, and it's going to sew right into the side seam of the pants itself.